Mary, thank you. Good afternoon. We're delighted to be with you today to explore the topic of Latinos in the workforce, assessing barriers and opportunities. With us today, we have Dr. Melissa Abad, Senior Research Scholar at Stanford VMware Women's Leadership Innovation Lab. Let's first define the workforce. How do Latinos participate in what is considered the workforce, and ultimately how these activities contribute to the U.S. economy? So let's begin. Dr. Abad, what does the workforce look like today?
That's a great question. And as you can see, I have my title slide here today. But what I want to do first is, again, thank Mary and Alex for having this event. And I'm excited to have this conversation. And so first, when I think about the barriers and opportunities the Latinx workforce face, I want to begin where the problem begins, right? And one of the reasons I want to begin where the problem begins is because it'll help us understand what the problem is so then we can figure out how to strategize to solve the problem. So first, the US Latino population comprises 19% of the US population, right? And so with that, I want to talk about how are we doing in terms of academic achievement and professional opportunities. We're 19% of the population. We tend to live in 5 states, or the majority of us live in 5 states: Illinois, California, Texas, Florida, and New York. And so the question is thinking about where we live and where we go to school will help us understand where to begin to understand the challenges we face in the workforce. I also want to note that as much as we are in these 5 states, the population is also changing. We're moving out of cities, we're moving into suburbs, and we're moving into the South. And lastly, we're also a very young population, right? When I think about the Latinx population in the New South, for example, it's sort of a 20 or 30 year phenomenon, right? So while we're following trends in California, Illinois, and Florida, for example, we also must have a lookout as to what's happening in the Southeast. Now, with that said, let's start with school. So at what rate do we complete our bachelor's degrees? And here I wanted to share with you where our data sits in relation to other groups, right? Again, we are 19% of the population, and what we see here is 2 things, actually 3 things. So first, in 2011, we were 14% of college degree recipients, and by 2021, we reached 21%. But I want to, as much as we're talking about the Latino population in the US, I also want to acknowledge that part of those numbers includes people who came from Latin America and Spain, and how they completed these, and they're included in the percentages. And why is that important? Because what it means to grow up in the United States school system is very different from what it means to grow up in Latin America and come into the United States. However, considering our experiences are very diverse, we're still grouped in the same categories. And I think it's important to start there because I think that's one of the barriers and opportunities in terms of understanding how to solve a problem. Is the Latinx community is extremely diverse. There's national origin, there's whether or not we go to public or private schools, there's gender identity. But I think for me, when it comes to understanding Latinidad in the United States, we have to acknowledge that when we're talking about professionals, there's this tension between US born and foreign born and how we're read by our colleagues. Second, going back to like degree completion in the United States, where did those of us who have completed bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and professional degrees compare to the rest of our community? And I thought this was important for a variety of reasons. First, the numbers don't look great. Like I said before, we are a young population. Also, when it comes to completing degrees, we fall behind. So there's a huge chunk of us who stop at high school. Why is this important? We can talk about the pipeline. However, what I really want to talk about is schools and how we're trained in schools. And here I'm going to draw from sociological research and my own personal experiences because I think it's important to see where we fit in the data, which is why we wanted to have a data-driven conversation today. So when it comes to high school, I think about a few things. 1, to what degree are we tracked? 2, to what degree are we being put in ESL classes because our parents don't speak English? 3, to what extent do our teachers think we are capable of competing with our white counterparts, right? 4th, what do our parents expect of us when we show up in school? One of my favorite papers from 2 sociologists looks at how Latino men and Latino women do in school. And one of the things for those of us who grew up in the United States is a lot of young men are pressure, depending on like the income of their parents, to start working really young. Young women, on the other hand, for a lot of different reasons, are forced to stay school and finish their homework. What does this mean? Latinas are more likely to finish degrees than their Latino male counterparts. There's a pressure to work sooner for males than there is for females, right? And there's certain ideas around what it means to be a good Latino male and a good Latina female when it comes to our relationship to school and work. And then let's get to the bachelor's degree, right? So now it's barely 15%, and the number keeps dwindling. And this is important to name for a few other reasons, right? When those of us who make it to college and finish our college degree, right, what narratives does that create for us when we do this? One of the things that struck me when I was an undergrad was how some of my suburban Latina counterparts were really frustrated that Chicago Latinas were doing just as well at Northwestern than I did, than she was, right? Because there was something about growing up in the suburbs in a well-resourced place that taught her that to be from Chicago meant our academic capabilities were lower coming from the city, right? And as we keep going further in terms of school, that also shapes the tension within our community, right? Especially when it comes to master's and professional's degrees. And more in particular, again, and this is where we're talking about the US born versus foreign born and what that looks like, what Latinidad looks like at those levels, right? Because the numbers begin to shift. And so to be a US born Latina who's completed a doctoral degree, I represent less than 1% of the population. And so what does that mean in terms of how I relate to the community? What does it mean to how I'm read by the community, right? And so, and then bringing that together in terms of how we understand barriers and opportunities, how do we read our success? Is our success an exception, or is our success a product of the network of individuals who brought us to where we are and the network of individuals that thought we were good enough to get to a certain degree? Third, now majors is also an important conversation. I was talking to Alex about this as we were prepping for this conversation today, and there's a few things I want to talk about. So earlier I talked about how we're treated in schools. And when I think about the Latinos I went to school with, right, many became teachers, many entered into the nonprofit sector or into healthcare, right? Where does that come from? It comes from a few different things. One, maybe we didn't like how we were treated by our teachers growing up, so we want to be part of the solution to fix the problem. So we might major in education. Two, when I think about the challenges we faced as children of immigrants, whether it's translating documents for our parents or trying to explain to our parents what, like the sort of the psychological violence of low expectations from teachers, right? Maybe we decide to do psychology and social work. Then for me in particular, I know I was influenced by this, thinking about the immigrant rights legislation and how problematic it's been over the last 20 years. Maybe we want to be lawyers. Maybe we want to go into business because we want to make a lot of money so we can help our families achieve that magical American dream. And so it's important to think about how our own experiences influence our majors, but also the other thing we talked about, Alex and I, was what options are available to us. For example, I know for me, when I got told I was going to get a PhD as a freshman, I had this Peruvian sociologist tell me, I am tired of all my Black and Latino students coming into my office telling me I'm going to be a doctor or lawyer to get my family out of the hood. Because as an angry woman of color, back when I was 19, I thought I was going to be a lawyer. And I was like, what is a PhD? I don't even know what that is, let alone trying to explain to my mother who wanted a lawyer and an MBA from her two daughters, and both of us ended up with PhDs, right? So it's like, how do we expose ourselves to the opportunities, to the wide breadth of options to establish economic security, to leverage our skill sets, and to develop a various set of skill sets, right? So when we think about barriers and opportunities, we have to think about the stories we've been told, what we have access to, and what we want to do with the skills that we've been given. Considering how much schools, teachers, and other people shape how we interpret the options in front of us. And this will be the last slide for this portion, right? So we've talked about schools, how schools teach us what we're capable of, how maybe the stressors our parents are dealing with influence our decisions, how our economic standing influences our decisions, how our economic goals influence our decisions. Now let's talk about how this shapes where we work, right? And we see a few things here. So unfortunately, as someone who's been studying the Latino workforce for the last 15 years, what's really interesting to me is how much work there is on low-income labor. A lot of it's based on research on Latino immigrants who came to the United States to work in manufacturing, in service work, as maids, etc., right? So as we see in these blue collar manual labor industries, we are overrepresented. On the other hand, when it comes to professional categories, we are underrepresented, right? And when we think about this journey from school to work, what I've tried to do in this first part of this presentation is paint a picture about where it starts to explain how we end up here. Because I think in understanding how we end up in the industries we end up in, then we can talk about why there's a pay gap. We can talk about what spaces we feel safe in, what spaces we feel comfortable in, and the decisions we make, and the decisions and the things we have to build to feel comfortable in the spaces that think we're not supposed to exist.
Thank you, Dr. Abad. That was extremely interesting, and I'm sure that our folks that have joined us today understand or see how this can lead to what some leaders lament, which is the pipeline problem. And you know, they talk about that they haven't, when they try and capture Latinos or Hispanic employees, that they're not staying in the industries or in the professional jobs that they're recruited for. How have you gone about offering any solutions to higher ups to combat this myth? And could you share with us any of the outcomes?
Sure. So there's a few ways I want to answer this question. So first, this pipeline problem. I think one of the things that irks me about the pipeline problem and how to fix it is that the way it's told is that we have to fix it, is that we're leaving. We're not leaving. You're pushing us out. You're pushing us out because you don't recognize our talent. You're pushing us out because there are certain things that we bring to the table that you don't value. And then we have to make a decision as to how we're going to show up at work. The number of conversations I've had with Latinas and other women of color about how we're pushed out because we're not being recognized. And it's really a conversation around, I just want to do my job. But how does me showing up doing my job offend you? Or why do I have to do all this extra work to explain to you why I'm qualified to be here? Again, you and I talked about this earlier, right? When we show up in particular spaces, people are like, well, what are you doing here, right? My first, and especially me with having a PhD, when I start naming the schools I went to and the degrees I have, like they're like, oh, and that look, right? It's like, yes, it's impressive to have a PhD, but that extra 3 seconds that you have that like surprised look on your face, I feel that. And I have to make a decision. Am I going to be offended at the fact that you've never seen someone like me exist, take up space, be this confident, be this smart? Or am I going to forgive you for not knowing any better?
That is certainly something that we could talk at length about. But let's focus on that professional and economic advancement, and I think that ties in with what we've been talking about.
Sure, thank you. And so for me, again, going from school to work, talking about the industries we end up in, I thought it was important to set the stage before going into VCs, entrepreneurship, and boards, because I want us to have a conversation, or at least have us think about what spaces do we have access to? How do we build relationships to advance, right? If a lot of the people who are supposed to guide us when we're young create a very narrow path along which we can exist, and those of us who are like, I don't like that path, I'm going to do something different, right? Like, what does it mean to do something different? And more importantly, what does it mean to build wealth? What does it mean if as we're on these narrow paths and decide to jump off of them to attempt to build wealth because we're not getting paid what we're worth in traditional jobs? Like, where does that stand? And so this is why I want to have the second part be about us going on, working for ourselves, as Alex did. So first, the Latinx investment professionals in venture capital. The numbers are abysmally low. So as we see in these two pie charts, I'm trying to read the numbers from the slide, sorry. But right, the percent of VC firms that have 2 or more Latinx professionals is less than 5%. And it's almost 0.25% for at least one, right? But when we think about the authority venture capitalists and venture capital firms have in shaping what gets funded, what gets through the stages of entrepreneurship and development, not having Latinx at the table, there might be something missing, right? When I think about critical education scholars, for example, and how they've begun to understand the different forms of knowledge Latinx youth bring to schools, I think when I see this slide, I think about, well, what does that mean in terms of venture capital? What does it mean in terms of creating products for people who've navigated a variety of different spaces, right? Whether it's the ethnic neighborhood, the immigrant family, the predominantly white school, the predominantly Latinx school, and then we make it with all these formal credentials that are supposedly enough to get us to where the industries we want to be in. The fact that the numbers for VC professionals among the Latinx community is so small means that there's things being left on the table, right? I think a lot of work in organizations, scholars who study the experiences of Latinx professionals talk about how we're being discriminated against. And what I try to do in my work is talk about what things are you missing by not having us at the table? What things, ways of knowing what products are not being funded because you don't think we're smart enough to be there? And I think this is a perfect example of what happens when that happens. And then two, I also want to see like note the growth, right? Because this is the trick, right? We're a young population. The rate at which we complete degrees is steadily increasing, but we're still not where we want to be. But I want to offer hope, right? And here what we see is that the number of Latino general partners has increased over time. The number of funds we have managed has increased over time. And the amount of money that we are managing has also increased over time. So slow gains. It's really important when I think about the pipeline question or the way we are leaving these industries. We're not leaving these industries. We're trying to find places to work that accept who we are, that accept the way we want to live. I remember one of the questions that was asked from one of the people who registered was like, well, what do I do? How can D&I solve this problem of the pay gap? Or how can D&I solve X? I don't think it's up to D&I. I think it's up to the larger organizational structures, to the larger workplaces. Again, building on this theme of venture capitalism and funding, right? So we're going from the profession, and now we're going into like who gets funded. And as we can see, there's change over time, right? But it's around 1 or 2% at each of these different stages. And I'm hoping Alex can tell her story, a little bit of her story, right? And I also want to shout out my undergrads who helped me prepare this presentation. So thank you, Casey Chavez and Natalie Del Valle, for helping me put this together. And the reason I mention that is because as I'm looking at the non-diverse owned, like huge gray block, right? That's just another way of saying white owned, right? There's so much work to protect the majority from like recognizing how much of the pie that they have. And when I think about a consumption power, right? And our loyalty, like the way we're loyal to particular brands and products, when I think about how we're not being funded considering the forms of knowledge we bring to the table, like it kind of breaks my heart. And again, it's like we're 19% of the population, but we can't crack 3 or 4% of the deals made with Latino-owned businesses. And so this chart of like the funding source really struck me for a variety of reasons. One, so Latino-owned businesses get more investors, but on average we get less money because we're considered risky. And it ties into this pipeline conversation, or the how controlling that narrative has become about, well, we don't know if they're going to do well, right? And one of the things that strikes me, especially as a Latina, is when we think about the rate at which Latinas complete degrees, it's higher than, proportionally higher than almost any other group, right? But at the end of the day, we're still considered risky. And I'll come back to the Latina theme later. Actually, this is perfect. Right? So let's talk about boards. We can talk about how we're trained. We can talk about how we are taught that maybe we don't belong in certain spaces, or maybe that first no that we get, that first funny look that we get completely pushes us out of certain spaces, right? Some of us are lucky enough to find a group of people who tell us they're crazy. That's on them. It's not on you. And I encourage you, right? How do you navigate this? Find your people. But going back to this boards conversation, the reason I mention that is because it's a question of access. What spaces do we think we deserve to have access to? And here, which is why I keep bringing up the Latina piece, is as you can see, the gender of Latino directors serving on public Fortune 1000 boards, Latina females outnumber Latino males, right? And when I think about the organizations I've been studying over the last 15 years, and not just workplaces, right? But these networking organizations where we come together to help each other out. A lot of the time, it's the Latinas doing all the work and the Latino males getting all the credit, right? So again, it's naming the progress and naming the division. So when we're thinking about the barriers and opportunities, I think it's important to name what our barriers are in the community to then figure out how to solve for them. And then secondly, right, as much as I've named how overrepresented, relatively speaking, Latinas are, compared to other groups, we're not doing that well, right? So when we look at the percentage of Fortune 1000 board seats held by Latinos, it's really, really small compared to the proportion we are of the population, right? So again, part of it's because we're young, but I think it's really important to think about how the way we take up spaces in schools, the way we are treated in schools, the way we are treated by career counselors, the way we are treated by managers who think we're either an exception or not, shape these outcomes overall. And then lastly, right, I just thought it'd be important to share what by industry where we sit, right? So we tend to be heavy on food, beverages, and tobacco. Our brand loyalty is deep, but on the other hand, right, so maybe some of the more financially lucrative run, we're not as high. Again, it's like, what spaces do we think we have access to, and what spaces are we invited to participate in? Thank you.
Very interesting.
Thanks.
And I think that when we look at Latinos in the workforce, we tend to think exclusively of working in a company. And what you've talked about is the entrepreneurial activity, which is growing within the United States. And what I've heard, and I don't have the numbers, it's being led by Latinas in opening up companies.
Yeah.
You know, personally, after 20 years in corporate,
Yeah.
I decided that it was time to set up my own shop.
Yeah.
So I'm a solo practitioner.
Yes.
But I have I've got now, about 10 years experience in being able to conduct my entrepreneurial
Sure.
activities as a strategic consulting. And I have learned a couple of things, and I call them the 3 C's. Of course, capital, access to capital, access to contracts, and access to collaboration. Partnering up with other solo practitioners when there are contracts that are worthy to come together and go after.
Yeah.
And it has been very eye-opening
Sure.
when it comes to being able to create wealth in a whole different environment
Sure.
than in industry or corporations.
Yeah.
I will also add that one of the learnings along the way is the importance of learning to be on a board. And that is understanding what governance is.
Yeah.
And that has a lot of importance, because when you sit at the table, you have influence over what the decisions
Of course.
are being made. And I think that's part of the entrepreneurial experience, and it's part of the creation of wealth from the younger population, which is the Latino based. So let's go, we can continue this conversation. We have a couple of questions that maybe we have some time.
Yes.
In addition to gender and race,
Yes.
age,
Yeah.
what may also be a cause of discrimination? What is your experience?
This is something that in another life I will pursue, but like place, right? I remember one question was, what states are Latinos booming in? I'm like, that's a hard question. So I'm a Chicago native, very proud Chicago girl in every sense of the word, from like being born here to having all my degrees from Chicago schools. And the reason I bring that up is because what it means to be a Latina in California is very different from what it means to be a Latina in Chicago. And so place influences everything from how you dress to how you behave to who counts, right? And so for me, it was really interesting because I went to California to study Latina professionals, but it's easily the hardest community for me to get into in terms of like gaining access to professionals, because I just didn't look Latina enough for California Latinas. So place, and I mentioned that too because I think, and research is showing, people don't work where they live. I understood, again, going back to barriers and opportunities, when I was on the job market and got this job offer, I'm like, oh my God, this is going to be crazy. I went to graduate school to study immigration. I made it a point not to go to apply to schools in California. And people were like, why? I was like, I am Puerto Rican studying Mexicans. I am not going to unpack that, what that means out there. And I'm not ready for like the measuring contest. And again, and Chicago was really interesting because we're all here. So we're all fluent in all things. Well, not all things, but, and so to get this job offer, I was like, oh, this is the universe playing a trick on me, but I'm gonna do this because it's Stanford University. Regardless of what happens, having Stanford on my resume is gonna like open 1,000 doors, right? I think every Booth graduate would argue that one of the reasons they go to Booth is because they know that's just gonna grease the door a little bit more. And so I mentally prepared myself. I was like, all right, we're gonna do this. I'm gonna be the one. And I joined a research team where I was the only person who looked like me. I was the only person interested in studying race. And so it's not only place, right? But I also think it's numbers. And intersecting with that too is like definitions of Latinidad, right? And how does my Latinidad fluency, for lack of a better way of saying it, like speak to the Latino, like what it means to be fluent in Latinidad in California? And how do I learn that, right? If I want access to that space. So, thank you.
And it is also, you talk about being Latina in California versus New York and other places.
Yeah.
Are there any cities that you know that you can say that there are Latinx that are thriving?
I think we're thriving everywhere. I think the question is what does thriving look like for you as a person? And again, it's when I remember the first time I walked into a grocery store, I saw plantains in the grocery store in California, and I was like, I'll be all right? Like, and it's something little, but that's the question you ask yourself. What do you need in your grocery store where you live? Or what do you need in your workplace where you live? Do you want to buy a house? One of the fortunate things about my professional journey is, I broke the rules and I left Chicago and I went up the street to UIC, and I learned so much from that. But I think one of the things that struck me was, because UIC is majority first generation, majority children of immigrants, and they're like, well, I can only be a social worker with a sociology degree. I was like, no, you can't. You can do like all kinds of things. I was going somewhere with this. Remind me the question one more time.
Cities where they
Right.
are thriving.
And so like when I think about what it took for me to leave, right, to leave home, and teaching young people that they can leave, right? I think that's the trick, and figuring out if you're like what you need to build to thrive wherever you are, and what you're willing to do
You know, we talk about making decisions along the way, and you've alluded to them. Well, if you go to Booth, something will open.
Yeah.
If you go to Stanford, something else opens. And we also hear two different things or definitions,
Sure.
or maybe you can help us with
Sure.
this. Sponsors versus mentors.
Okay.
What are they? And
That's a great
how
question.
would you use one or the other?
Okay. I think those two words are thrown around a lot, and it's really not clear how we get about them. And I always think, this is a common theme in what I'm trying to say today is, what do you actually need, right? I think, well, go find a mentor. For what? Right? And I think what's helped the both of us is taking the time to figure out, what am I working towards? I wanted to be an innovative organizational theorist who brought in theories of race and ethnicity into how we understand organizational behavior, which is very different from people who study diversity, because I'm not looking at interactions, I'm actually looking at bureaucratic structures. When I was studying immigrant organizations, when I got to grad school, I thought I was going to study social movements, and then, like a good researcher, I followed the data, and I was like, oh no, that's not what I'm studying. So instead of working with the person I went to grad school to work for, I went and had my advisor was someone who studied work. He knew nothing about immigration. I was like, that's fine. But I found other ways to have that expertise on my dissertation committee. And so when you think about mentors, think about what areas do you need mentorship in? Again, grad school, one of my favorite terms is like an advisory board. So there were people who helped me take care of my mental health. There were people who taught me how to manage my relationship with my committee. There were scholars who pushed me intellectually, and I needed all of them, right? And when I think about other sectors, the question is, okay, so if I'm going to enter this industry, how do I make it through? Who will know? I also want to name, and I was talking to my undergraduate research assistants about this last week. Don't go for the person who's like super popular and like in this particular field of expertise, because they may never be around, right? They're brilliant, but they may not be a good mentor, right? And I say that too in terms of like in other industries, right? Like if you're in corporate, like maybe you want the person who's on Fortune 500 to be your company, but are they going to be a good mentor to you? Are they going to speak to you in a way that jives with you? And you can be discerning. You can make that decision. It doesn't have to be Mr. Popular. Some of my best mentors and sponsors were not the people who with like the glittery lights around their names. It was the people who spoke my name in the room because they knew I needed to be there. When I applied for the Stanford job, it was one of my mentors in grad school who, like, after sending my materials to my committee for like 3 months, she was like, oh no, this is not how you, and she completely rearranged my stuff. She was on my committee, she was in a different discipline, but she probably helped me get this job. And I made it a point to reach out to her and thank her, and make it a point to let people know how I'm doing, because I think that's the other important thing about mentorship and sponsorship. You have to like let them know that you're doing well. So a mentor is someone who will guide you in a particular arena. A sponsor is a person who will speak your name when you're not in the room. And so the question is what do you want them to be saying? Because we have to teach them what to say. There's so much research on how, like reference letters for people of color is like, talks about either what we struggled with or talks about how exceptional we are, but they don't talk about our skill sets. So we have to train the people doing this kind of work to use the right language that speaks to what you want to be spoken about you.
And that is so powerful, what you've just said. For a sponsor, to work with a sponsor who will mention your name when you're not in the room.
Yeah.
And being able to also give the sponsor the language of how to describe your skill set and who you are and why you are of value.
I just think, and we were talking about this the other day too, when I think about the number of Latinx professionals I've talked to over the last 2 decades, we're like asking for permission. There's and we're so grateful to be in the room. I'm like, but really? No. They're lucky to have us in the room.
Absolutely.
Because we bring so much.
And that's, I think, part of, there's a number that we haven't mentioned and that you've alluded to, which is the wage gap.
Yes.
57 cents a Latina makes.
Yeah.
And I bring this up because of what you just said. We bring so much, and we think we're lucky to be in the room.
Yeah.
Can you mention your experience of making sure?
Yeah. Oh my God.
How do you negotiate this?
How do you negotiate this? You ask everyone and their best friend what you should ask for. And I love telling stories. So when I was like, I was on the job market. It was dire. It was bad. And in terms of I wasn't getting any hits. And then I applied for this job in June. It was supposed to start in August. I wasn't finished with my dissertation when I got the job interview or the job offer. And I was like, how the heck am I going to do this? And my mom was like, you say it's Stanford. You say yes. I was like, the Bay Area is the most expensive region in the country. I need to make sure I can afford to live there. I need to make sure I can afford to move there. And then finish the degree and graduate, because I like to close doors, right? So all this to say, what are your standards of living and your standards of existing and your standards of like workplace culture? If you don't know what those are, start talking to people and ask them what you should be asking for. I mean, I talked to like 15 people as I was trying to finish my dissertation and pack up my life and move to California. Stressful 6 months. And almost every time I went and asked her, I'm like, well, we don't know. Because I was the first, so not only am I the first woman of color they hire, I'm the first person they hire out of state. I'm the first person they hire who isn't finished with their PhD. And I was like, can we not make me a bunch of firsts at the same time while I'm trying to finish the degree? And I was lucky to get the job where I did, and they found the resources for everything that I asked for. And so the job that was originally supposed to start August 1st, I didn't start until January.
And that takes a lot of strategic thinking.
Sure.
So I have a question,
Yes.
and I'm sure our participants would be curious to know if there are organizations or industries out there that help prepare that young person who's going through a similar
Sure.
negotiation that can help them prepare in supporting them to look at strategically what questions to ask, how to really help reduce that pay gap.
Oh my, there's so many, and I'm gonna be plugging a lot of them right now. I think YouTube and LinkedIn are your best friends. Everything's on YouTube and LinkedIn. The lab I worked for when we originally started, we had a close relationship with Lean In and leanin.org. So we actually have a series of videos, the Voice and Influence program, on our website. And one of them is on negotiation. And I'm glad you brought that up too, because a few weeks ago, Forbes came out with an article where women of color will accept the first offer they get.
I saw that.
And Glassdoor is also your good friend. There's all these platforms that are places where you have conversations. But I think most importantly, and I'm getting better at this with my friends in particular, we have to start talking about how much we make. I think women in particular, and especially people and women of color, and I would say Latinas based on my personal experience, we don't like to talk about money, but we're also scared of money. But if we don't talk about it, we're never gonna know. And I think, and we were talking about this earlier today, what do we think we have access to? What do we think we are worth, right? We should learn how to invest. We should learn how to, what it means to be a VC. We should be in these rooms and be uncomfortable. But having said that, if you're gonna be uncomfortable, you also have to have places of comfort. I'm on the phone with my mother every day. The friends I've made across my various schoolings, I'm still in touch with. I have luckily found other Midwestern transplants in the Bay Area so that I, feel comfortable, and some locals who are really supportive. And I think you need both when we think about what it means to find a mentor, what it means to find a sponsor, what it means to negotiate, right? One of my favorite experiences was when I was, the last class I was TAing at UIC. It was around career development, and she's like, well, I don't know what I want to do. I was like, how about we go backwards? I was like, do you want to own a house? She's like, why are you asking me that? I was like, because if you want to own a house, then you can figure out how much you have to pay, how much the mortgage is. And then if your rent or mortgage is supposed to be 30% of your income, then you can figure out what the number is. And she looked at me like I was crazy. I was like, no, that's not crazy. That's smart. And all of this is available at your fingertips, right? But to your point, it's about thinking strategically. I think it's this, and it's not our fault. When I think about the conversations I had with my mother around money and things like that, I was like, this economy is broken. Inequality is growing exponentially. It's just not, I'm part of the 5% and I live in an area where I can't buy a house. That's just free market logics. And so if we begin to learn the different resources at our disposal and how to put them in conversation with each other and what the standards of life we have, all of my young Latinas over the last 2 decades, that's a conversation we have. It's do you want to know my saving strategy? Let's talk about it. Do you want to know my investment strategy? Let's talk about it. Do you want to know how yeah.
I have that also in having that conversation because when I think about Latinos participating in the workforce, that's a very narrow definition. You have to expand. What does that mean, workforce?
Yeah.
And you brought a very good example of the workforce. Where am I working and how much is the mortgage and all of the things that make the wealth creation and the ability of using the skills that you've obtained, whether you're in a corporation, a small business, or whether you sit on a board and get options, stock options. It is about creating and being able to participate. I have another question regarding this. When you think about the creation of assets, and we're talking mortgage, we're talking about all of that.
Sure.
What type of infrastructure should a Latina or Latino think about in creating assets?
What do you mean?
Well, workforce.
Sure.
You talked about mentoring your group to
Yeah.
invest,
Yeah.
to participate in the
Sure.
401k.
Yeah.
What advice would you give any of our any of our listeners?
That's a big question.
It is a big question.
Wow, this is gonna take me a minute. Figure out how risk averse you are,
Yes.
and what your financial responsibilities are. Because one of the other things, to the point of wealth creation, and studies have shown this, especially among Latinas, is one of our biggest barriers to building wealth is we're helping our family, because it's collective wealth, right? And so when it comes to buying that house, I'm probably not buying the house because I'm probably bailing my parents out of something or my little brother out of something. And it's a choice. There's no judgment. But it's a conversation we need to have. And so if you're doing that, what can you do for you, right? Because sometimes we get so caught up in the web, the complicated web that is family and support, that we forget to cut out a piece. And so for me, I'll just use my own. I've been meeting with a financial advisor through work from go. I was paying loans. I was trying to figure out how to afford the Bay Area, and trying to figure out how to build wealth, so I could have a down payment. And so, and one of my favorite, and I talk to young people about this too, like, and I'm starting here to eventually work to Boothies, but there's most of these set things are free, right? Like I met with my financial advising at the banks I'm a part of for free to have the conversation, and then once you have those initial conversations, figure out what do I need to pay for, what do I have accessible for free, and then do that. And again, it's like YouTube and Google are your best friends in terms of figuring out where to start. Also, use your friends. I think one of the things, and I do too. I mean, and this links back to your conversation about where you're thriving. What industry do you want to be in?
Yes.
Chicago and New York are great for finance.
Yes.
Silicon Valley, Austin, Atlanta, great for tech. They're not right? And so, and I mention that because for me, when I have financial decisions, I have some of my best friends are in finance. I'm like, what do I do about this? Like, the knowledge network that you've built as a Boothie is crazy. So tap into it.
And that has such an impact on Latinos participating in the workforce.
Yeah.
And you bring up, if you are looking at finance, Chicago, New York, or IT,
Yeah.
the high tech.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's part of being very conscious and strategic in making choices
Sure.
when you participate
Yeah.
in this workforce, however
Right.
you define it.
Right. Right. And I think to your point, to build on this idea of conversations, right? Like, people under the age of 40 are switching industries, right? Like, we change socks. It's, my mom worked at Children's and Lurie's my entire life, right?
And
like,
what is she doing now?
retired. But I'm probably not going to have that. My friends aren't having that kind of career. And so we have to be honest about what is safe for us. And it links back to one of your first questions. When I go into companies, like, you do realize you mess up with like one of us, you mess up with 50 of us because we know each other.
Well, and also the fact is, right now, one of the numbers I think that you mentioned was that 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 5 is Latino in participating in the workforce.
Yeah.
That's going to change. That's increasing.
Yeah. Because the other thing too is, and my students were not happy about in suburban Illinois, they were not happy about this. In this country, having kids is expensive.
Yes, it is.
In this country, the more degrees you have, the less likely you are going to be to have kids. And as flawed as the immigration policies are, like, one of the things, and most developed countries have this, they need to encourage international migration because that's how their population is going to be reproduced. And so to your point, considering how Latinx population was like the #1 sender between like the 1960s and like basically before 9/11, right? They're coming of age soon. They're going to be more than 1 to 5. And so what's really fun about being at this stage and like the role that I have and the connections I get to build is we get to teach the younger generation what they have access to.
Okay. Now let's go back to that first question, which was about the pipeline.
Sure.
And we talked about it from the workforce perspective.
Yeah.
But if you had someone who was the senior VP of talent or,
Sure.
or HR,
Sure.
what advice would you give that person of making sure that the environment sustained the Latino workforce?
Oh my God, that is a great question that I have not thought about in a very long time. Recognition matters. And this is where it gets tricky, right? Because companies will, as we are seeing in the last few months, will do whatever they can to like cut the bottom line, right? And we don't know that, and we don't leverage that to our advantage. And so to the VP of talent, I was like, how are you recognizing, outside of like special announcements, because that's not appreciation. Appreciation is a paycheck. Appreciation is a bonus. Appreciation is like economic. How are you doing that, right? When I think about the different states that allow you, that are having companies advertise how much they're gonna like pay their employees versus not, right? Like how transparent are you? As someone who's begun to dabble into the structure of D&I, right, and what they're able to advocate for in organizations, it's really hard to make a lot of these things transparent. And what's interesting for me, being from here, like when I think about old school industries versus new school industries, i.e. tech versus like a finance or whatever, is that the older industries are a lot more transparent. The job ladder is transparent. It's clear what one needs to do, but these newer industries are so vague about this. So clarity, transparency, recognition, and like evening things out. Yeah.
That's those are all very important, and that is very. You see that more in established companies. Startups are a little bit different, and when we talk about the tech industry,
Sure.
some of those are not yet at that place of being able to do that.
Right. No, and so shameless plug. I have a friend. She put together an edited volume on like diversity management, and I have a chapter in there on intersectionality and diversity management. And one of my things, to your point about startups, is when I think about D&I structure, it's brought in so late in the game that a lot of the like problematic practices are already built in, and because it's so brought in so late, etc., it's hard to create that change, right? So the earlier you bring it in, the better the outcome will be.
Absolutely. Now we're coming towards the end of
Yes.
our conversation. Any other ideas or suggestions for those individuals that are interested in continuing to pursue this topic, Latinos in the workforce?
The work is coming, and get various resources. I think to be in this space, in the Latinx workforce, and to see what's out there, I was like, oh, I have to do better than this, because they're not telling our full stories, and there's a lot of nuance that they're missing. And so I'm excited to be part of that change, right? But if you're like, as a member of the workforce, figure out which part of change you want to be. Yeah, which part of the change do you want to be, and it's okay to make a lot of money.
As a Boothie, I agree with you completely.
Yeah, thank you.
So, do you have any questions for me?
If you could, what advice would your 30-year-old self, what advice would you give your 30-year-old self?
That is a very difficult question. I think I would have said to my 30-year-old self to take advantage of every opportunity that comes your way. Because sometimes we think, well, this came to me, but I don't have time, or I can't focus on it, thinking that, again, it will come. And sometimes opportunities show up once, and you have to take that opportunity and take the risk. I had an opportunity many years ago with a company that was looking for someone to do more of their international international business, and I was at that point also moving, and I kept thinking, I just can't do both. So, and then afterwards I thought, I should have done that. But that's, I think, if you hear the knock on the door, open it and go and do it. Do what it is asking you to do. Take that risk, and enjoy it, because everything that comes your way is just it's a gift. You learn so much.
Yeah.
The other one would be to have identified a sponsor earlier.
Okay.
So I think we're coming towards the end
Yes.
of our conversation today. We'd like to thank everyone here who has joined us today, and also make sure that you, sometime in the future, you look at what other dialogue sessions will come your way. I'm sure you'll get the emails. And Dr. Abad, thank you so much for your conversation, your insights, and we've had a very interesting conversation today. Thank you.
Also, thank you for paving the way for young Latinx Boothties.
Thank you.